used to clean that room every single day, ever since Mrs. Monroe lost her daughter in the fire all those years ago. It was a quiet room, but never lifeless. It held on to the scent of damp wood, of old ashes that never fully settled, and of the perfume Margaret sprayed every morning when she still believed her child might be safe, somewhere beyond the reach of news reports and burnt trees. I wiped the windows, smoothed the faded rose tablecloth that had been bleached pale by summers too long, and left without asking questions. She never spoke of the fire again, but her silence was thick, not from denial, but from the need to preserve something unspeakable. Some wounds, I've learned, are not buried out of shame, but because letting them remain untouched is the only way to remember that. Once, hope still had a pulse. Then, 15 years later, she returned, or someone who seemed to be her. Margaret received a phone call that left her frozen in the kitchen, the knife still in her hand, glistening with apple juice as she stared through the window, like the mountains themselves might confirm the impossible. The next morning, a group arrived, and at the center stood a girl, large eyes, dark hair, calm voice, and polite in a way that left no trace. She didn't speak much, didn't demand anything, and when I poured her water, Margaret wrapped her in trembling arms and whispered Isabel, as if the name had been waiting in her throat for a decade and a half. Needing only a body to reclaim it. I didn't believe it, but I didn't protest either. I'd grown old in that house, and years of dusting hallways had taught me the discipline of keeping other people's tragedies out of my bones. Still, memory has its own stubborn rhythm, and mine, though dulled by years of liniment and swollen joints, remembered a different child. Not one embraced by cameras and declarations, but a girl pulled from the fire, ash-coated, unnamed, and left in the care of a hospital that had no next of kin to contact. I remembered her because I had helped mop the emergency ward floors when the nurses were short-staffed after the blaze. And I had seen her, eyes open, skin streaked with soot, and a silver bracelet engraved with OW hanging loosely around her wrist. I remembered that bracelet clearly, because I was the one who placed it on the stainless steel tray while the nurse logged her forgotten belongings. Years later, I found that bracelet again. It had slipped from Isabel's wrist while she was playing in the Monroe living room. I picked it up, held it in my hand, and waited for Margaret to react. But she didn't look. No one noticed. Isabel took it back without flinching, smiling as if the object had never left her skin, as if it had always belonged to her. That smile, too poised, too ready, unsettled me in a way I couldn't name. I said nothing, but from then on, I cleaned that room not just with routine, but with reverence, as though I were wiping away the fingerprints of a memory no one had asked me to keep. I never told Margaret, not out of fear, but because I knew the truth would not be accepted from someone like me. The truth never belongs to the help. It must rise from blood, from something that cannot be rehearsed, from the kind of presence that does not need to be believed to still exist. And the day that presence arrived, I recognized it before she spoke. She came to the door. No tears, no papers, no accusations. She simply asked to see Ethan, the boy who rarely spoke but saw everything in his own silent way. And when she looked at me, I remembered her eyes, not because they resembled anyone else's, but because I had seen those same eyes once looking through me, as if trying to locate a world that had already decided she didn't matter. And in that moment, I understood. Isabel was embraced. Olivia was abandoned. Not because one was better or louder or more deserving, but because destiny often whispers in ash, and sometimes only those of us who sweep the floors remember where the ashes used to fall.
They say children forget, That a baby rescued from fire won't carry memories of the smoke, the screams, or the moment the world burned itself into silence. But they were wrong, because Olivia had never forgotten the quiet that came afterward, the kind that pressed into her skin and stayed like soot beneath her fingernails. Long after the flames had disappeared, she grew up in a town where the silence settled in the walls and never left. In a foster home that wasn't cruel, but where every corner echoed with things left unsaid. There were no birthdays with themes or candles lit in joy, only secondhand cakes and names that never truly fit. The man who raised her, Mr. Claiborne, was neither affectionate nor distant. His hands trembled when turning pages, but his voice remained steady as he read to her each night. He never claimed her as his daughter, never asked her to forget what was lost. But in the quiet way he set her plate and folded her blankets. He made her feel like something worth salvaging, not a burden, not a mistake, but a blessing carved from ash. She didn't ask about her parents, not because the questions weren't there, but because the answers had already collapsed into silence. Every document was smudged or redacted, every thread of truth too frayed to follow. The story she was told was simple. Her mother had died in the fire. No one said it gently, and no one said it twice. It was delivered like a fact, sharp, sterile, irreversible, and she had accepted it the way a child accepts winter, as something cold, inevitable, and unchangeable. Years passed with her questions folded tightly inside. She became the kind of woman who listened more than she spoke, who left rooms quietly, and who knew how to disappear without ever truly leaving. Her life was made of soft exits and steady routines, until one afternoon, when the air smelled like wet asphalt and unfinished thoughts. She stopped by the diner for coffee. The television was on above the counter, muted, flickering, and though she tried not to watch, a flash of color and movement drew her gaze. On the screen, a woman in silk held a girl with long dark hair, surrounded by candles, confetti, and applause. The caption read, "After 15 years, Monroe family reunites with missing daughter." Her hand tightened around the paper cup until the lid caved inward. She leaned closer, not because she didn't believe what she saw, but because she recognized it too quickly, too deeply. Not the woman, but the girl standing beside her, wearing a dress Olivia could never afford and a face Olivia could never forget. She had seen that girl before, not on screens but in shelters, under flickering hallway lights, curled up on a bunk bed 2 rows down. That girl had been clever, careful, manipulative in a way children shouldn't know how to be. One night, long after lights out, she had reached over and traced the bracelet on Olivia's wrist. Silver, delicate, engraved with the letters OW. A thing Olivia never took off. They had swapped bracelets like it meant nothing, but only one of them gave it back. Olivia left the diner before the broadcast had finished, her movements steady but hollow, as if some part of her had already stepped out the moment the headline appeared. Behind her, the coffee cup remained untouched on the counter, its cardboard softening under the slow spread of condensation, not discarded in haste, but abandoned with the quiet finality of someone who had just remembered what it means to be erased. She didn't cry, nor did she speak, and as she stepped into the rain, her body moved with the strange, heavy grace of someone returning not to a place, but to a question that had waited years in silence, knowing she would someday come back to hear its name. At home. Mr. Claiborne was asleep in his chair, the newspaper folded neatly across his chest. She stood in the kitchen for a long time, watching a single drop of water gather at the tip of the faucet, growing heavy, shimmering with the weight of unspoken years, until it finally fell. The silence in the room felt different now. It was no longer something she had inherited, it was something that had been placed around her, like a veil, like a lock. And for the first time in her life, Olivia no longer asked where she came from. She asked, with something deeper than anger and older than grief, who had taken her place? She arrived at the Monroe estate the way one returns to a place they've never been but always feared, cautious, silent, uncertain whether the ground beneath her feet would recognize the shape of her loss. There were no gates, no guards, no signs of exclusion. And yet the property itself seemed to recoil from her presence, as if memory could build its own defenses out of stone and absence. Olivia stood on the gravel edge of the driveway, her hands tucked deep into the pockets of a coat she had outgrown emotionally, but never physically, staring at a home large enough to hold everything she had never been allowed to want. She hadn't come to make demands, to accuse or claim. She had come to look, to see what was given away, without anyone realizing something had been stolen. She needed to confirm whether the story on the screen was real, or whether her past had been forged into someone else's fairy tale. The house loomed in that quiet, ancestral way some homes do, not shouting wealth, but whispering legacy, as if it had weathered storms just to prove it could survive heartbreak. Ivy crawled up its brick facade like time trying to reclaim something, and the air smelled of trimmed hedges and restrained grief. Olivia didn't step forward. She remained on the periphery, where the wind carried just enough of the laughter drifting through the open window to remind her that warmth had a sound, and it was not hers. The front door opened before she had even decided whether to move closer, and a woman emerged, posture poised, face composed, movements exact. Margaret Monroe. A luxury car turned into the driveway behind her, and from the back seat came a girl whose walk struck Olivia in the stomach like a memory she hadn't prepared to relive. The girl exited with the grace of someone rehearsed for reunions, wearing polished shoes and a silk dress that caught the light too easily, as if it had never known real darkness. She looked up at Margaret with a smile Olivia remembered, not from love, but from manipulation dressed in innocence, and looped her arm into Margaret's like they were carved from the same blood. That girl's name was Isabel Monroe now, but Olivia knew it had not always been. Years ago, in the foster home that smelled of mildew and warmed canned soup, that same girl had learned how to survive by stealing what wasn't hers and calling it destiny. Olivia recalled the night the bracelet went missing. Silver, engraved, the only relic left from the fire, and how it turned up days later on that girl's wrist, flashing beneath the overhead light like a victory she wasn't supposed to win. The girl had smiled then, the same smile she wore now, as if to say, "What's yours is only yours if you can keep it." And Olivia hadn't said a word, because back then, silence was safer than truth, and truth was never welcome when spoken from a bottom bunk. Now, she stood under a sky that was beginning to bruise with rain, watching that girl, now someone else's daughter, step into a role built from the ruins of Olivia's origin. She didn't approach, she didn't interrupt, she simply watched, letting the weight of the moment soak into her like water into tired soil, refusing to be erased by time or elegance. When the front door finally closed and the sound of cameras faded into quiet, Olivia turned and walked away, her shoes soft against the gravel, her shoulders squared not in anger, but in recognition. Because in that brief exchange of glances, no words, no accusation, Isabel had seen her, and for a flicker too fast to fake, something in the girl's expression cracked, as if the mirror she had believed shattered was somehow still whole and standing. Olivia walked until the house vanished behind hedges and trees, not because she was done, but because some ghosts don't have to haunt to be remembered. There is a particular kind of ache that doesn't stem from what was taken, but from seeing your absence paraded around as someone else's treasure. Olivia had grown familiar with longing in quiet forms, the kind that came from birthday candles lit on someone else's cake, from classrooms where her name never appeared on the bulletin board, from being the afterthought in a photograph that wasn't hers. But this was different. This was the ache of erasure in real time, of watching someone wear her identity like silk, smooth and blameless, as if it had always belonged to them, and on that borrowed wrist, glinting beneath the lights of staged affection, sat the only piece of her past that had survived the fire. She never returned to the Monroe estate, not physically, but Olivia saw the girl everywhere. In newspaper spreads folded over coffee counters, in soft interviews where words were chosen like crystal and smiles arranged like furniture. Isabel Monroe had become a name stitched into public memory. The photographs always told the same story: a girl of grace, of reunification, of undeniable belonging, and in every frame, the bracelet gleamed, a simple, elegant arc of silver engraved with OW, the very initials Olivia had once clutched as her only anchor in a life built on soot. Margaret, when asked, would gesture to it proudly. It was found with her. That's how I knew. That bracelet, once a detail of private grief, had now become the centerpiece of a lie told so sweetly that even the walls believed it. It wasn't just a symbol anymore. It was the key, the verification, the proof that love could survive fire and come home wearing new shoes. Olivia remembered it well, not just its weight, but the way it had vanished during one long night in foster care, when she had been too sick to notice anything except the chill in her bones. She had awakened without it, the warmth around her wrist gone, and she had searched her sheets in silence, knowing somehow that speaking up would only tighten the loss. A week later, the bracelet reappeared, not in her drawer, not returned with apology, but glistening on Isabel's wrist as she laughed under the hallway light. Olivia had asked then, gently, if it was hers. And Isabel had shrugged, offered a half smile, and said she didn't remember where it came from. Maybe it's mine. Or maybe not. Olivia hadn't fought, because even then, she knew that truth, spoken too loudly by someone invisible, starts to sound like jealousy. Now, the girl wore it with polished grace, sitting beside Margaret at luncheons, answering questions about memory and loss as though the answers had always belonged to her. Olivia watched from the margins, not with rage, but with the clarity of someone who had learned that timing is sharper than anger, and that stories, once dressed in satin and repetition, begin to look like facts. The bracelet had become her signature, her origin story, her crown. But Olivia knew better. She knew where it came from. She knew who had worn it first, and she knew that one day, the girl now called Isabel would have to face the truth not as a revelation, but as a reflection, because truth, like metal, doesn't burn, it bends, it hides, it waits, and when it returns, it gleams, not to dazzle, but to reveal who never owned it to begin with. The first time she saw Ethan, he was standing in the greenhouse behind the Monroe estate, surrounded by orchids that looked too fragile to breathe. He wasn't facing her, his back slightly hunched, one hand resting on the curve of a terracotta pot. And yet, Olivia recognized him instantly, not from resemblance, but from stillness. There's a kind of silence children like Ethan carry into adulthood, a silence not of confusion, but of clarity too sharp to fit in spoken words. She watched from a distance, not daring to speak. Because some things are remembered better when left undisturbed. She had found his name weeks earlier in an old article archived online, one of those polite features that local journalists write when a family has something photogenic to offer. It mentioned Ethan in a single line. Ethan Monroe, the older brother, lives at home, mostly keeps to himself. And that was enough. She remembered him from the night she'd been taken away from the hospital, not by family, but by the state, when he had stared at her through a window with eyes wide and hands pressed to the glass. They were children then, and even though no one introduced them, she knew in her bones that he had been the only one who saw her leave. Now he was grown, taller, but with the same unspoken gravity. Olivia didn't try to reach out through official channels. Instead, she visited the botanical nursery near the estate until she saw him again. Hands covered in soil, sleeves rolled to the elbows, speaking softly to the plants. She waited until he stepped away from the counter and then approached, not with certainty, but with care, as if her presence might shatter something delicate. She didn't bring evidence. She didn't mention the fire. She only spoke of things small enough to fit between memory and instinct. The smell of burnt pine needles, the softness of the blue blanket from the hospital, the song a nurse had once hummed while adjusting the light above the bed. He didn't respond with words, but something in his expression shifted. Not disbelief, not fear, but recognition without language, like a photograph remembered before it's seen. She knew better than to press. She thanked him for the plants, turned away, and walked slowly down the gravel path, her steps unhurried, her breathing steady. That was all she needed. Not validation, not tears, not a reunion scripted for an audience, but a glimpse of truth seen without being asked to prove it. At home. She wrote nothing down. She didn't call anyone. She simply sat by the window of her rented room, watching the light settle on the glass like dust, and allowed herself to feel something quieter than hope, but louder than despair. There was no triumph in being almost believed. Just a strange kind of stillness that wrapped around her chest like a bandage applied too late. Olivia didn't want Isabel's dinners or Margaret's apologies, or the family crest engraved on heirloom silver. She didn't want the life that had been built on a stolen name. She only wanted to reclaim what had been whispered out of her, one memory at a time, because for her, identity wasn't a place to return to. It was a thread she had never let go of, even when the world called it forgotten. It didn't take long for silence to curdle into suspicion. Someone had seen her near the Monroe estate, not close enough to be accused, but just close enough to become a whisper. And in a town like theirs, whispers didn't float. They pierced. Olivia had always known that truth. When cornered, doesn't explode. It corrodes. It settles into polite conversations like sediment, unnoticed until it stains. Isabel, who had mastered the art of fitting herself into narratives that weren't hers, didn't wait for suspicion to grow into challenge. Instead, she moved first, quickly and precisely, as though exposure was a stain she'd spent years preventing. The rumors didn't shout, they slithered. First, in sideways glances from strangers at the nursery, then in sudden pauses from clerks who once greeted her by name, and finally in the soft hostility of online whispers, vague references to a girl from the system, someone who'd lied before, who might have stolen, who might have burned something once, though no one could recall exactly where or when. The details didn't matter. The doubt was enough. Olivia didn't push back, not because she agreed, but because she knew there are storms you don't brace against. You outlast them by becoming the stone beneath the rain. And in that stillness, she remembered something Mr. Claiborne once told her. They can't erase you if you refuse to disappear. She knew Isabel's strategy by instinct, not because it was subtle, but because it was familiar. Charm weaponized into protection. pity repurposed into camouflage. Isabel didn't need to point fingers. She didn't have to lie directly. All she had to do was tilt her voice just enough to cast shadows behind Olivia's name, to let others do the rest. And Margaret, already too deep into the comfort of believing her daughter had returned, didn't question what suited her peace. She let the silence between Olivia and the world swell until it echoed as guilt. One afternoon, as Olivia passed the bakery window, she caught her own reflection beside a poster taped to the glass, a photograph of Isabel and Margaret smiling over lemon tarts. The words, "Family, found again," curling beneath them in script. She didn't stop. She didn't look away. But in that fleeting moment, she saw something in her own eyes, not sadness, not defeat, but a stillness so rooted it could no longer be shaken. It wasn't vengeance. It wasn't pain. It was the kind of clarity that grows only in people who've been lied about so long they no longer flinch when the lie changes shape. Isabel wanted confrontation, a burst, an accusation, anything that would confirm the story she was feeding the town. But Olivia didn't give it to her. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't correct the whispers. She simply moved through the day like someone carrying a truth too deep for words, wearing her silence not as surrender but as armor, because she understood now that dignity, when worn quietly, can outlive even the loudest betrayals. That evening, Olivia returned to her small room, switched on no lights, and sat by the window with only the hush of night to keep her company. She thought of Isabel's smile, of the careful cruelty wrapped in kindness, and of Ethan's brief, unspoken recognition, that flicker of memory that couldn't be faked. She didn't journal it. She didn't mark the day. She simply breathed, slow, steady, without urgency, like someone who had finally made peace with being unseen, so long as she remained unerased. Because the truth she carried had no need to shout. It had learned to move through shadow, undisturbed, and it knew exactly where to stand when the light returned. She left Monroe before the sun could fully rise, walking past houses still asleep, their windows closed like eyes unwilling to witness what the world had refused to name. No suitcase, no message, just a coat, a bus ticket, and a silence too familiar to explain. She didn't return to Claiborne's porch or ask for old rooms to be reopened. She simply went back to Oregon, not for comfort, but because some places hold the weight of who you were, even when no one else remembers. It happened on a Thursday, wrapped in soft gray light, the kind of day where even time seemed reluctant to move forward. And in that hush, something finally stirred. Ethan Monroe stood in the hallway outside the dining room, surrounded by stillness so familiar it had become indistinguishable from the air itself. He wasn't waiting. Not exactly. More like pausing between two shadows, caught in a memory that had never fully left him. He often stood like that, in thresholds rather than destinations, as if some part of him always knew that the truth lives in the spaces people avoid. So when his breath caught mid-step and his fingers curled against his palm, no one noticed at first, but something inside him had already started to break the surface. Isabel entered the room with the grace she had learned to wear like a second skin. Silk scarf, soft heels, her presence stitched into the Monroe routine with expert precision. She greeted Margaret with polished ease, rearranged a tray of cutlery, and in doing so, revealed just enough of her wrist for the bracelet to catch the light. A glint, a flash, a quiet betrayal masquerading as familiarity. For a moment, everything seemed to hold still. And then Ethan saw it, really saw it, not as jewelry, but as evidence of a lie his body had remembered before his mind ever could. The sound that escaped him was not loud, not sharp, but it carried weight like something that had been trapped too long behind silence. "It's not hers," he said, not with anger, not with force, but with the kind of clarity that slices clean through disbelief. The room did not stir. Chairs remained still, untouched by panic. And the silence that followed Ethan's words was not broken by gasps, but by something heavier, the realization that disbelief had just been disarmed. Isabel didn't speak or move. She neither reached for her wrist nor attempted a smile, standing instead in perfect stillness, as though any attempt to explain might shatter what little remained of her illusion. Ethan, trembling now, looked not at her, but at his mother. His voice gone again, but his expression louder than any scream. In his eyes, there was no confusion, only firelight reflected from 15 years ago, and a girl whose name no one bothered to ask as they wheeled her away. And though he hadn't spoken her name, the silence between them echoed it with more certainty than words ever could. Margaret didn't ask why. She didn't raise her voice. She walked to her study with the restraint of someone walking through glass, picked up the phone, and called the family physician. She didn't explain the situation, didn't confess her suspicion. She simply requested DNA testing, quiet, clinical, immediate, because she could no longer afford to trust a memory without confirmation. The request moved through the house like a ripple beneath polished floors. Silent, but deep. That evening, after the lights had dimmed and doors were locked without good nights, Ethan returned to the greenhouse. He didn't water the plants. He didn't touch the soil. He simply stood there, surrounded by orchids and glass, his reflection no longer fragmented but whole, as if truth had finally found a body to rest in. Ethan didn't smile, nor did he cry. He simply stood beneath the greenhouse lights, surrounded by orchids and misted glass, with an expression that held not release, but resolve that had finally found shape, and in a town 2 states away, in a room where the window blinds cut the moonlight into quiet ribbons. Olivia stirred awake without knowing why. Her breath tightened, her gaze sharpened, and in that suspended moment, the body responded to something the mind had not yet named. It wasn't certainty grounded in logic, and it wasn't a revelation born from proof. It was a reverberation from a place deeper than reason, one that told her the silence had been broken somewhere far away, and not by her. Because when truth finally moves, it doesn't knock. It enters quietly, and remembers what you forgot to guard. The envelope arrived without sound or urgency, no knock, no courier, no voice to foreshadow its weight. Just a slip of white, folded cleanly, dropped into the brass mail slot like any other letter, landing against the tile with the gentleness of a story preparing to end. Margaret found it early, before voices had entered the rooms, before the kettle had boiled, before Isabel had even stirred upstairs, and she stood beside the kitchen window holding it like something both fragile and fatal. She didn't tear it open with urgency, nor did she hesitate in fear, but simply stared at the seam, as if it were a scar she had forgotten how to trace. And in that stillness, long before the letter was opened, she already knew that some truths arrive without heat, but still scald when touched. When she did break the seal, the paper yielded without resistance. Its surface was smooth, its folds clinical, and the contents within carried the detachment of language built to measure, not to feel. There were no flourishes, no emotion, no attempt at softness. There were only coded sequences, markers aligned, compared, and verified, followed by a single line anchored at the bottom of the page. Isabel Monroe is not biologically related to Margaret Monroe. The sentence did not argue, nor did it interpret. It simply existed, final, quiet, irreversible. and Margaret read it once, then again, and again, and again, as though repetition might peel back a different ending. But the words refused to change shape, and, in their stillness, they told her what memory had tried to protect. Upstairs, Isabel painted her face in a mirror, trained not to reflect doubt. Her gestures were careful, measured, the tilt of a wrist, the subtle lift of a jaw, the practiced symmetry of someone who had long since learned to construct herself in layers. She hadn't seen the letter, hadn't heard the pause that had settled in the floorboards below, but somewhere in her breath, something shifted, not violently, but like static before a storm. As she adjusted the bracelet on her wrist, silver, old, undeserved, the air around her pulsed differently, as if the house itself had begun to remember. Margaret placed the letter on the kitchen table beside a half-finished glass of water and pulled from a drawer an old photo album, the kind whose pages curled with humidity and age. She did not speak or cry, instead. Her fingers turned with care until she found the photo she had hidden from herself for over a decade. A hospital image. A baby with ash-dusted skin. Swaddled in blue, with a loose bracelet marked OW, dangling from a wrist too small to hold anything but survival. And in that image, she saw not proof, but a silence that had waited 15 years to be believed. That evening, Isabel found the envelope exactly where Margaret had left it, not hidden, not obscured, but visible in its ordinariness, resting beneath a set of car keys and beside an apple bruised from disuse. She read the line once, and something in her breath shifted, not broken, but stretched, like glass beginning to bend beneath heat. She didn't discard the letter, nor did she collapse beneath its weight. She simply placed it back with mechanical precision, as if by restoring its place she could delay what it meant. But in her reflection, caught dimly in the kitchen window, her face no longer looked familiar, not even to herself, because impersonation has no mirror that lasts forever. Far away, under a different morning sky, Olivia rose into a silence that tasted unfamiliar. She hadn't seen a message. No one had called, but her chest felt different, not light, not heavy, but real. As she tied her hair back, her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from some deep instinct that something long buried had begun to reach upward through the dark. Because the truth, when printed in code, needs no witness to exist. It only needs to be opened. She didn't bring a suitcase. She didn't tell anyone she was coming. She walked the long road from the station in silence, letting the gravel shift beneath her soles and the trees cast shadows that moved like ghosts from a past she had never been allowed to bury. The gate was already open when she arrived. Not wide, but enough to suggest someone had left it so, deliberately, almost carefully, as if to say, "You may come in." Not because you were asked, but because you were always meant to return. Olivia didn't hesitate. She didn't announce herself. She only walked through the entrance like a name spoken back into a room after being forgotten for too long. And in that quiet, the wind did not welcome her, but it did not resist her either, because some spaces do not belong to those who stay, but to those who survive. Margaret was in the foyer, standing beneath the same chandelier that had once glimmered above Isabel's curated smiles and staged reunions. She had been waiting, not pacing, not wringing her hands, only standing, as if every minute since the letter arrived had existed to bring her to this one. When Olivia stepped forward, she saw that Margaret was not composed, not elegant, not collected. She was human, and the cost of her silence had finally come to collect its debt. There were no prepared words, no rehearsed declarations. There was only Margaret's voice, cracking not from volume, but from the weight of what had not been said. "I should have known," she whispered, not with shame, but with ache. I should have looked closer, asked louder, waited longer. Then, after a pause that seemed to stretch across every year Olivia had lived without a name, she added, "I'm sorry." Olivia didn't respond with words. She didn't need to. She reached into her coat and pulled from its pocket the thin, weathered bracelet that had once fit a wrist small enough to be forgotten, and placed it into Margaret's open palm. Her fingers lingering just long enough to be felt, not held. Margaret didn't speak again. She only looked down at the silver, and something behind her eyes, not tears, but recognition, finally settled, because apologies, when true, do not ask to be forgiven, they simply meet the wound where it still lives. Upstairs. Isabel sat at the edge of her bed, her hands motionless, her suitcase already half-packed. She had known this moment would come, not from prophecy, but from the silence that had grown colder since the envelope had been opened. She hadn't spoken to Margaret in days. She hadn't dared look Ethan in the eye. And now, as she listened to the quiet exchange below, no shouting, no blame, she realized that the thing she had feared most was not being confronted, but being left out of the story without anyone needing to explain why. She closed the suitcase slowly, without anger, without defiance. Because the worst goodbye is the one that arrives without being spoken. Back in the garden, Ethan had been kneeling in the soil, fingers buried in earth that didn't ask questions. When Olivia stepped outside, he rose without brushing the dirt from his hands, and for a moment, neither of them moved. He didn't call her name. He didn't say welcome back. He only stepped forward and placed his hand, stained with soil, warm with memory, onto hers. Not with hesitation, but with memory that had finally found its voice through gesture. And Olivia, who had never needed words to know where she belonged, closed her eyes for a breath that was deeper than arrival, softer than forgiveness. Because some homecomings do not require doors to be unlocked, only hearts that stop pretending they were never waiting. The house did not return to noise after the truth came. It settled instead into a kind of hush that clung to the corners like dust stirred by a long-awaited opening. No one rearranged furniture. No one made declarations. They moved through the rooms with a gentleness that was not grief, but recognition, as though each hallway had finally admitted what it had been built to forget. Olivia did not sleep in Isabel's room. She didn't ask for it. She chose the one at the end of the hall, smaller, facing east, where morning arrived more quietly and the light broke through the curtains like an apology too soft to name. And Margaret, who had once filled this house with words meant for the wrong girl, now knocked only once each morning, leaving a folded blanket, a warm mug, and space. On the third day, she lingered in the doorway longer than usual. Her voice did not tremble, but her fingers closed tighter around the doorknob as she spoke, her breath folding between sentences like someone trying not to disturb a wound that had finally crusted over. "This house is yours," she said, not as permission, but as a correction. "You were always mine, long before smoke blurred our memory, long before silence replaced our names, long before I let someone else define the shape of my own blood." Olivia didn't look up right away. She only reached for the mug, held it with both hands, and nodded once, not to accept, but to say, "I heard you where words didn't reach before." That afternoon, Ethan sat beneath the dogwood tree, his back resting against the bark, knees drawn up, eyes blinking slowly beneath the dappled light. He hadn't spoken much since Olivia's return, not out of discomfort, but out of a strange reverence, like the presence of something that had once been lost and now demanded silence more than explanation. When she joined him in the grass, she didn't say a word either. She lowered herself a small distance away, enough to be near without intruding, and tilted her face toward the branches overhead as though they could translate everything that had remained unsaid for too long. Time moved without markers. The leaves rustled in rhythms that had nothing to do with clocks. And then, in a voice that seemed to rise not from his chest, but from a memory kept warm in his palms, Ethan turned slightly and said her name, not in syllables, but in bond. "You're my sister," he said, gently, without emphasis, not like a declaration, but like someone pointing to something that had always been true, but forgotten under dust. Olivia exhaled slowly, as if breathing through the ache that had been waiting for that sentence since the day she was removed from every family tree. She didn't offer gratitude or reply with symmetry. Instead, she turned her palm upward, leaving it open between them like a space meant not to be filled, but to be reached. And Ethan, who had never needed noise to understand belonging, placed his hand over hers, firm and without delay, his fingers folding with quiet intent as though his skin remembered what his voice had only just recovered. They stayed that way as the sun began to lower, as the wind folded the dogwood's leaves into gentle spirals, and as light crawled slowly across the grass, softening every edge. Margaret watched from the upper landing, hand resting on the railing, breath held not from fear, but from awe. Not because something was finally fixed, but because a fracture had learned to hold without splitting again, because some ties do not return through words alone, they arrive through hands that learn to stay. She traveled light, not because she was in a hurry, but because some destinations require less baggage than return, and more reverence than words, in her bag. There was a scarf he once said matched her eyes in spring, a pair of gloves he mended when they tore, and a paper-wrapped parcel of candied almonds that once lived in a jar on the windowsill like tiny tokens of reassurance. The train didn't rush, and Olivia didn't mind. The land rolled past in soft, forgiving folds, stitched with fences and memory, the kind not carried in photographs, but in the breath between stops. She didn't look for signs. She didn't rehearse what she would say. Because some journeys aren't measured in miles, but in the weight that lifts when you know where you're going. The cottage hadn't changed. The porch still leaned slightly to the left. The screen door still creaked at its top hinge, and the ivy still curled stubbornly around the rusted mailbox as if time had promised to wait a little longer. Olivia didn't knock as an announcement. She knocked because it was something she had always done, even when she lived there, a quiet courtesy between those who shared space without ownership. The door opened with the same sound she remembered, and Mr. Claiborne stood just as she'd last seen him, eyes steady, jaw firm, posture patient, not startled, not aged, just there. He didn't ask why she came. He didn't say her name. He simply moved aside, letting her in with the same gesture he used when she was 12 and had come home wet from the rain without explanation. She sat where she always had, cross-legged in the old armchair by the stove, the fabric worn to memory and comfort, the scent of pine and dust wrapping around her shoulders like something remembered before it was felt. He poured tea with the steadiness of someone who understood that conversation begins not with speech, but with presence, and set the cup before her like an offering that required no return. She accepted it with both hands, letting the warmth sit in her palms before lifting it to her lips, as if anchoring herself to the weight of being seen without judgment. "I saw her," Olivia said, her voice low, not strained, but drawn from the chest like something unlatched gently. "And I saw the bracelet, the one I lost the night I woke up alone. She wore it like a story she believed enough to make real, but it was mine before it was ever claimed." Mr. Claiborne didn't answer. He didn't tilt his head or shift in his chair. He only looked at her with the same stillness that once steadied her through years of not belonging anywhere else. I didn't want their house, she continued, her fingers brushing the rim of the cup slowly. And I didn't want her life. I just wanted to be certain I hadn't imagined the fire, or my name. His voice came quiet, low, and certain. You were never lost. Live. You were waiting to be called back by something that finally remembered how. They didn't speak for a long while after that. Outside. The wind creaked the old gutters, and the stove hissed with warmth that didn't demand thanks when she stood to leave. She didn't say goodbye. She stepped forward, leaned in the way she used to when words had failed her as a child, and pressed a soft kiss to his shoulder, not out of sentiment, but as punctuation for what had already been said without needing repetition. I found it, she murmured, her voice barely above breath, and I brought it back where it always belonged. She stepped onto the porch without haste, the air colder now, but not unfriendly. The sky had dimmed into a velvet hush, and the path before her was neither bright nor dark. It simply existed. Open. Waiting. She walked toward the Monroe gate again, not to enter as a stranger or as a victor, but as someone who had once been removed and had now returned by choice. She didn't pause at the entrance. She didn't look back. She stepped forward, steady and unshaken. And as her foot touched the first stone of the garden path, the house didn't flinch. It recognized her. Because I never took her place, I just took my name back. And sometimes, reclaiming your name is not about ownership. It's about becoming impossible to erase.